right. I think that's a... Okay. I think we should go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you all for being here. My name is Base Goggin. I'm the director of the Texas Public Interest Research Group, or just TexPIRG for short. We're so grateful for all of our panelists and all of you participants joining with us today. Just quickly, I'd like to give a big thank you to our co-sponsors for the event, the National Vote at Home Institute, Arnold Ventures, and Take Back Our Republic. Also, I have a housekeeping note on technology. If you are having any sort of technical problems and you don't have your kids around to solve it for you, please use the raise hand feature, which should be at either the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on which view you're in. Also, if you are wanting to ask a question, which is a big part of this, we hope that you will participate in our question and answer session. Then you may use the Q&A feature, which again will either be on the bottom or top of your screen. That will go to Lauren, who will then relay the question to our moderator, Steve. For those of you who haven't heard of us, TexPIRG is an advocate for the public interest. We speak out for a healthier, safer world in which we all feel freer to pursue our own individual well-being and the common good. The problems that we're trying to address aren't progressive or conservative. They're just problems that our country shouldn't tolerate in an age of great abundance and technological progress. And these problems, they affect us all, whether we live in blue state, red state, purple state. And so that's why we're working to find common ground around common sense ideas. Right now, that common sense idea is an expansion of vote by mail. The novel coronavirus pandemic poses a very real threat to our elections. And recently, for those of you following closely on the issue, Judge Sulak, who is a district appellate court judge in Travis County, issued a decision that would include COVID-19 as a valid excuse to request an absentee ballot in the upcoming primary runoffs. While we expect that decision to continue being litigated, we do need to prepare now. And given what we've seen in other states, it's reasonable to expect that many Texans will want to avail themselves of the opportunity to vote by mail during this pandemic. So we're here today to discuss that. What will that mean for Texas? What should our election officials expect and prepare for? What safeguards need to be put in place to ensure both safe and secure elections? How might this change who turns out to vote or stays in to vote in this case? How can the state ensure the integrity of the election? Can we pull this off in short amount of times? Or just a few of the questions we hope will be answered. This panel, distinguished bipartisan panel, represents exactly the sort of experts we should be listening to. So, enough from me. That's all I'll end up saying today. I'd like to introduce our moderator, the Honorable Steve Wolens. Chairman Wolens served as a member of the Texas House of Representatives for 24 years and was named one of Texas' 10 best legislators on 6 separate occasions. In 2003, Texas Monthly said that at the end of the session, he passed the best ethics bill in the history of the Texas legislature. One of the great legislators of the modern era logged another big win. He currently serves as a commissioner on the bipartisan Texas Ethics Commission after most recently serving 2 terms as the chairperson of that commission. So I am honored to welcome and turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Betty. Greetings from Texas. Our first panelist today is Secretary Kim Wyman. Speaking with her today from Olympia, Washington, Kim is in her 7th year as the Republican Washington Secretary of State, a position that she was elected to in the year 2012. She's got 10 years of county elections administrator experience, and she is uniquely qualified to discuss not only the plumbing, but the policy of elections. She knows it from the top down and from the bottom up. Kim, as the Secretary of State, you're the person most responsible for your state being a national leader in voter participation, voter engagement, and in security. What impact has vote by mail had on your state?
Well, our state has really been a vote by mail state since 2010. We had kind of evolved over the preceding 20 years from allowing anyone to be a permanent absentee voter in 1993 to having very high participation as absentee voters, where our counties were seeing 60%, 1 in 6 voters, or 6 in 10 voters, excuse me, were getting an absentee ballot every election. And we had some elections where 90% of the ballots were cast by mail, even in a polling place environment. We had the closest governor's race in the country's history in 2004. And after 2.7 million ballots were cast, we had 2 recounts and a court case, and the winner won by 133 votes. And following that experience, our state legislature gave us the option at the county level to move over to vote by mail. And most of our counties moved in that year in 2005. And it still took our state 5 years to build out the capacity in our bigger counties and the political will to move to vote by mail completely. And I'm not sure if I answered the question, but at least gave you that baseline history of what we went through.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Our second panelist is Dr. Robert Stein, who's sitting over there with earphones in his ears, looking quite comfortable. He's coming to us from Houston, Texas. Bob Stein is professor of political science at Rice University and a fellow at the Baker Institute think tank. His research is centered on alternative methods of voting in the United States, and he's written extensively on how natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes impact election administration and how to mitigate their impact on voter participation. Bob, welcome. Tell us what steps our local and state officials can take to respond to COVID-19 that may impede or disrupt the operation of scheduled elections.
If you can hear my background, it's thundering and lightning here in Houston, so I might lose my power. I'm not kidding. We had lots of hurricanes and lots of flooding. So if I can take a few minutes, I'm going to share my screen and put up a PowerPoint that might be useful. And if you can all see that, tell me if not. All of this is on Monkey Cage. It's a piece that I wrote with good friends of Phil, Charles Stewart and Barry Burden. Well, Barry's at University of Wisconsin, Charles is at MIT. And I may take a somewhat more controversial position on this. I'll tell you from the get-go, I don't think Texas can ramp up its vote by mail system in time for the November election. I'll try to explain why. And I think it's exactly what Ms. Wyman just said. If I remember, I think Phil Keisling will tell you the same. It took the states of Colorado, it took the state of Oregon, and of course, as Kim just said, Washington, several years to cure their voter mail ballot system. This is not an easy system to do. I'm a huge fan of it, and once it's done, it's well worth the investment. But be careful what you wish for, and let me explain why. And I'll go quickly, and Stephen, just stop me if I'm going too long. First, how we vote. Look at the numbers here. Most people still vote on election day. Mail is a quarter of the vote cast in the 14, 16, and 18 election. And then in-person early voting, as we all know, is a little smaller, but together, close to half, 45% of voters are voting before election day. All this data is from the Election Administration, Election Assistance Commission, pretty reliable source. 5 states, as we've heard, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Utah, now have mail ballots to all registered voters. 33 have no excuse. The remaining 13, like my own state of Texas, you got to raise your hand and ask for that ballot and have a good excuse. Most of it is being over 65, illness, and traveling. This map, and it's all available. I know the group of TexPIRG will send you this, but look at the country. It's in the west of the Mississippi. Mostly Republican states, when they adopted, like Ms. Wyman pointed out, that have what we call this relaxed form of mail-in. My home of New York, the East is a little bit behind the times, so they've caught up in this last election season. But here's what's interesting. Mail voting is very deceptive. If you take out the 5, 6, or 7 states that average almost 80% of the ballot being cast by mail, the rest of the 43 are averaging no more than 11%. To scale 11% to 20, to 30, to 40, even to 50, any one of the 2 panelists with me, Phil and Kim, will tell you, it's not hard. I mean, in the sense that it's arduous, it just takes time. And here are the problems. 1, let's talk about the positives. Everybody knows, I think some of them, advantages of vote by mail in a coronavirus, it's safer. It's just plain, simply safer. Minimizes poll worker contact. Mail ballots have a higher rates of completion. No question. It's a take-home exam. You can cheat. You can actually take your phone with you. Can't do that on election day. Mail ballot costs are significantly lower. I did a project for Pew. Phil remembers. We're cutting the cost of conducting an election by a third in some places. Colorado was the biggest one I've seen. No evidence. I want to be clear about this. There is absolutely no scholarly evidence to show that partisan differences in the use of vote by mail. The only differences are older people, because we only let older people in some states vote by mail, and that tends to correlate with voting by mail among Republicans. And there's no question, it has a positive effect on turnout. Look at Iowa, that used to be #1 in voter turnout, has now been eclipsed by virtually all of the states that have vote by mail. This is no brainer. Problem. Leaks in the vote by mail system. And I hope I'm not getting a bad echo here. Estimated in 2008 that almost 4 million requested ballots were never received. Why would that be? Ask Kim and Phil. It takes time to take the voter list and get it matched up with the US Postal Service. And believe it or not, the Postal Service has a very specific way to deliver mail, and the voter list often is just to get you into the right precinct, not to deliver the mail ballot. A mail ballot's almost 3 million are never returned. When you start a vote by mail system, a lot of voters don't know the rules. They don't know when to return their ballots. They don't know that they have to sign them. And believe it or not, a lot of people don't know how to fill out a mail ballot. My students don't know how to do an optically scanned bubble. We've been voting on DREs for so long, we're not used to actually sitting down and writing on a piece of paper. Of course, people make mistakes, but they can be easily corrected when they're in the voting booth. Not easily corrected in the voting booth, easily corrected in the voting booth, but not by mail. I know California and Phil's state, I'm sure Kim does this, cure some ballots and let people know that they didn't sign their ballot, didn't mark it. But again, vote by mail systems, when they're done well, wonderful, but they don't get done in 3 months, 4 months, and we have 185 days. These are all the things. The thing to remember is it took years, not months, to set up a vote by mail system. My view would be, in my own state, which requires that you be over 65, disabled, or otherwise out of the jurisdiction, that the vote by mail system would actually disenfranchise many, many more people. We wouldn't get the ballots to them. The ballots wouldn't be properly signed and properly marked, and they, most importantly, wouldn't be returned in time. Something to consider is that to make this election safe in 2020, we're going to have to do what the epidemiologists are doing with the coronavirus, push the curve down. That means what? It means spreading out voters, both in time and in space. My state, and Stephen and I are from Texas, have something called in-person early voting in Colorado, and technically so does Washington and all the vote by mail states, because you get your ballot early. But what's important about in-person early voting is that you have in our state 13 days, up to 12 hours a day, at as many as 50 in my own county of Harris, 58 early voting locations. And you can create or find locations that are big box. And by doing that, you can spread people out. That's the way to make it. If you try to do a vote by mail only, it will, I think, utterly fail in terms of making it equitable for people who move around, for people who have not voted by mail before, and only 6 to 7% in my state ballot by mail.
Let's jump in and hear let's hear from Phil. I'd like to know what his experiences have been in Oregon. Phil Keisling is the former Democratic Secretary of State of Oregon, serving from 91 to 99. He also had the distinction of serving in the Oregon House. Until recently served as the director of the Hatfield School of Government at Portland State University. Phil, you successfully led the Vote at Home ballot initiative in Oregon 22 years ago. 5 months ago, the New York Times listed you as one of the 5 great problem solvers for that effort. Tell us about Oregon's experience with vote by mail, please.
Well, first of all, the New York Times has it a bit wrong. I deserve nowhere near that kind of credit for what happened in Oregon. It started 40 years ago, 1981. A local county clerk asked an interesting question. If we're already printing out sample ballots, why don't we just send people the real thing? And it took a number of years. It took state legislative action to give permission to local governments to run an election this way. But by the time I got into office in 1991, most local elections were being conducted this way, and they were discovering some remarkable things. They saved a lot of money. Voters vastly preferred it, and it also saved a lot of money because you weren't hiring all the poll workers, basically. You still had to hire people. You bring them into central counting that verify signatures, to process ballots, et cetera. So in 1998, all that we really did was we made the elections of primaries and general elections also be allowed to be done this way. Washington State went county by county, but they did it for every election. We had to pass a ballot measure in order to make the primary and the general election also done this way. I want to talk a little bit, though, about how to reframe the conversation in ways that I think will help advance it and give some insight. And I start with what will sound to people like an utterly absurd statement, but be patient, please. In states like Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, where 100% of active registered voters receive their ballots in the mail, the vast majority of voters do not vote by mail. Emphasis on vote, emphasis on the verb. People return their ballots in person far more often today than they do through the U.S. Postal Service. Now, I'm a great fan of the Postal Service. I think they do a good job. No institution is perfect, and they have many challenges, not the least of which is Congress's refusal to fund them. But this is important to understand because the second half of what I now call a vote at home system, because that is a more accurate way to describe it, is the robust infrastructure of drop sites and vote centers. Think of them as satellite election offices, essentially, where people can take their ballots and, in many cases, update a registration, get a new ballot to replace one that might have been lost or damaged, get assistance if they need language or other kinds of assistance. So I think the lift in a state is a good deal less than many realize. Now, I will not disagree with my friend Dr. Stein about Texas's challenge. And first and foremost, I'd start by just abolishing any excuse at all. There's utterly no good policy reason to say to people who are under 65, you must have an excuse, you must be out of the county for the entire 13 days of the early voting period. Don't care whether you have 2 or 3 jobs, you got kids to take care of, two work shifts. But then they say to people 65 and older, hey, you're totally off the hook. Any of you who want to do this can. I think that's where I would focus right now in Texas. But we now have 2 states that for the first time east of the Mississippi have held one major election where more than half the people voted with mailed out ballots. This happened just within the last month. Wisconsin on April 7th, and today, Ohio will hold its primary where probably close to 90% of the ballots cast will have been by mail. Confusion, chaos, all of that, and they've got a lot of lessons that are important to learn. But Maryland is having a congressional district vacancy election held by mailing everybody their ballots. First time that's happened east of the Mississippi River in U.S. history. And so far, I hear that election is going relatively well. So this isn't an exotic creature that's fully sprung from some weird corners of the Western United States. Absentee ballots, so-called mailed out ballots, have been with us for over 150 years. And out of necessity, I think that you're going to see more states by August when the primaries are done have voted with 50% or more of their votes cast this way. And that's going to be a huge milestone. Don't disagree that a lot of states can't do it by November, but I think it's much less daunting than some of the other things this country is facing, quite honestly, at this point. And I put the question on the table, what if you had no choice? What if in October, COVID-19 or COVID-21 or influenza, or you name it, comes roaring back, and you're faced with the prospect of you just literally cannot ask people to publicly go to a polling place? I think we have to be planning for the worst while we're hoping for the best. And none of us hope that this virus is around in the fall and we could open every polling place that we ever had before. But we'd be not responsible if we weren't planning as if we had to, and that includes every state, including Texas.
Can you hear me speaking?
Yes.
Very good. The fourth panelist is Joe Reddy, Director of the U.S. Public Interest Research Group and our host for today's webinar. Joe?
Still on mute, Joe. There you go.
Got it. Thanks everybody. Yeah, I run U.S. PIRG's Democracy for the People campaign, so I lead our work related to fixing our democracy, whether that's improving election systems or getting big money out of politics. And these days, since the vast majority of good democracy reform work is happening at the state level, I work really closely with all of our state directors. And so what I want to talk about specifically is, it gets back to a little bit to what Kim was talking about earlier about the political will to make things happen. And so specifically, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the bipartisan support for specifically expanding access to vote by mail during this pandemic, because as I think everybody here is familiar, there, you know, if it wasn't clear before Wisconsin happened, it's very clear now that the coronavirus is an emergency for our democracy. And so to avoid what I would think would be sort of a worst case scenario, a Texas-sized version of the Wisconsin situation, we in Texas, we need to expand, focus on expanding what is for that state the most workable solution, which would be exactly what has already been mentioned, expanding absentee voting by mail. Because again, that just gives people the option to choose how to cast their ballot and eliminates that sort of lose-lose scenario where a person is forced to pick between their health and their right to vote. As Dr. Stein was saying earlier, you know, there's no partisan advantage to doing this, but the reality is there is in fact a lot of bipartisan support behind expanding vote by mail opportunities, because honestly it just makes sense to most people. You know, if I'm based in New York, I don't leave my apartment hardly ever at this point, and most people are understandably afraid of venturing out into crowded public places, and we all know all too often our polling places are exactly just that, right? They're crowded public places. And so if you give people the option to vote without going into that sort of scenario, they're going to do that. And the more people that take that option, the safer our polls become. And so it's a simple thing, and it is in fact very popular. Recently, that as much as 2/3 of Americans support expanding mail-in ballot options to all voters. Not universal mail, right? Because as we've mentioned, that would be a big lift in 6 months. But giving everybody the option and making sure that people have the ability to cast a vote by a ballot by mail in November is incredibly popular. And it's not just one of these situations. What I'm taking great heart in is it's not just one of these situations where you know, the polls say everybody likes this, but the politics say nobody does it. Because the reality is we've actually seen bipartisan action on this issue as well. In Ohio, you know, Governor DeWine and Secretary of State LaRose are both Republicans. They've done a lot of work to try and expand vote by mail options for the elections that are happening today. And as Phil was saying, they'll likely be over 50% vote by mail. Governor Sununu of New Hampshire, also a Republican, has made it clear that in November, voters can cite the pandemic as a reason to request absentee ballots. And Republican election officials in West Virginia, or in Idaho and South Dakota and Nebraska, just lots of places are doing the work to give this option to people. So the thing that I often hear is that, you know, vote by mail is only a blue state thing, or vote by mail is only a Democrat thing, and it's just not true. And so we know that there is the sort of grassroots support, the sort of public support for making sure that everybody has an opportunity to safely and securely cast their ballot, and expanding, you know, absentee balloting, removing the excuses and the barriers that provide that exact opportunity for people. And so that's the sort of thing that we need to do. And I think the other advantage here is honestly, expanding absentee voting is not something we have to work through the DC gridlock to achieve. States ultimately determine how to run our elections. So Texas can decide and make this decision to do the right thing and create the opportunity for everybody to vote safely. Not just in the primary runoffs, but also in November. So, obviously it's a big lift. There's a lot of work to do. And, I know many of our esteemed panelists can speak to the specifics of what any given place would need to do to actually make this happen. It's a lot of work, but there is the political support there to make it happen. So don't let that hold you back.
Joe, so let's put it in context. Texas, the legislature meets in January. If the legislature were inclined to come into a special session, I think I heard Bob Stein say that as a practical matter, there's not enough time to put into effect any statutory changes. Bob, what's your response? What can local and state election officials do on their own in the absence of changing the laws now? Briefly.
As much as I want to agree with Joe and with Kim and Phil who've done it, and our friend Judge Choate in Colorado, I think it's dangerous to advocate for absentee vote-in balloting in states. If you looked at my slide, I think Ohio ran 27% on average in a presidential election vote by mail. That's more than 4 times what Texas. Assume that you could get some agreement among Democrats and Republicans. You won't. That's just not happening. Democrats think this is the panacea. Republicans think it's the Antichrist, and they're both wrong for very different reasons, but both wrong. You talk to Phil and Kim. They've run elections. I've worked at the polls. You cannot. I'm going to read you some numbers, which will, I think, upset you. I don't know what Joe's quoting from national polls, but here in Texas, both Democrats and Republicans would prefer to vote in person on or before Election Day. You can't get overwhelming support. Yes, everybody wants people to vote by mail, but remember, when you talk, this is a survey of 1,000 registered voters in Texas. I'm 2/3 of the way through. I don't know where Joe lives, but in America, where I live, we're still split down the middle. Second, there's no bipartisan support in Ohio for going to vote by mail. I lived in Ohio. Talk to Sherrod Brown, the senator. Everybody's furious at the governor for what he's been doing. Courageous, right, safe, but his Republican base in the state legislature was not applauding when he tried to, one, postpone the election today and then go to vote by mail.
Bob, so I still want to get to what can state and local election officials do in the absence of statutory changes. But before we get there, Kim and Phil, do you want to respond to what Joe had to say? I'm kind of interested from your actual experience running administration of voting in Oregon and in Washington, your take on it. I understand that there may be bipartisan support, but I'd like to make certain that from your perspective, it does not favor one party versus the other party. And if you would also confront the issues about safeguarding the election process so that there is no abuse. Kim, would you go first?
I was all set for Phil to go first. Yeah, so I think the real heart of this and what Texas county election officials and the Secretary of State need to be working on right now, regardless of how the politics shake out and any legislative changes happen, is they have to be anticipating a dramatic increase in absentee ballots at the very minimum. 16% of our nation's population is over 65 years old, and I'm sure it's very similar in Texas, maybe even skews higher than 16%. So if you're seeing a 4 or 5% return of absentee ballots in a normal election, you have to anticipate significant, at least doubling, tripling, quadrupling those base numbers, and I think it will still be higher than that. So you have to have that ramp up. You have to take an account of how are you going to count those ballots. First of all, how are you going to issue them? Are you going to use a mailing service to do the mail out? Are you going to do it in-house? And if you are going to do it in-house, do you have the actual capabilities to make that mailing happen? Do you have the permits in place with your post office, for example, the ballot envelope design, all of those mechanical things? On the back end, as those ballots come in, as I think, I can't remember which speaker mentioned it, you've got a voting period of time, not just a single day to build to. So in our state, it's a 20-day period prior to election day where voters can get and receive and return a ballot. So you have to have election officials and capacity in terms of space and equipment to process those incoming ballots. And your larger size counties, you're talking about processing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of ballots. And in our state, we see a trend where half of the ballots come in election week. So you have to kind of do the math. How many ballots do we anticipate getting if 25% of our normal turnout shows up and votes by mail? Run those numbers and do that quantifying. And then finally, after all this, you have to build out and make sure you have the equipment, personnel, and space in your operation. Now with social distancing, 6 times the space to do that processing, which might also mean working in shifts. And I say all of this because those are the physical requirements and the personnel requirements, but then you have to build in all of those checks and balances, that electronic and physical audit trail that instills confidence. In my state, I'm a Republican in a very blue state, and I have to convince, quite frankly, the staunchest Republicans in my caucuses and my constituents in Eastern Washington in particular, that this election system is safe and secure and fair. And you do that by balancing access and security. So if you make same-day registration a thing, which it is in Washington State, where people can come in up till 8 o'clock election night, register and get a ballot and vote, I have to build in the compensating controls that ensures that no matter how many times a voter does that and how many ballots are issued, only one gets counted. So those are the kinds of things that Texas needs to build in. And I'm certain that election officials at the county levels are working pretty hard right now with wrestling with those very issues.
Thanks, Phil. What are your thoughts about it?
Secretary Wyman is just spot on. The logistical challenges are incredibly important to think through, and also to recognize that there's a whole new normal in 2020 because of COVID-19. 2 million Texans already are eligible to get a vote-at-home ballot by simply asking for one. Those are roughly, I think, the population that's over 65 that's registered voters. How many more on top of that will be able to qualify, even if the law stays completely unchanged? Could be several million more, especially if, again, this thing comes roaring back. So preparing for the worst and hoping for the best is that framework that I think has to govern here. And in addition to all the considerations that Secretary Wyman noted, I think the signature verification process is going to be especially important in every state. I think Washington has one of the best. It requires that if a ballot comes back with no signature or a signature that can't be matched, the presumption is in favor of the voter. But if agreement with a bipartisan team is no, that signature doesn't look like it matches close enough, then the voter's notified with every piece of information they've supplied to the election official, cell phones, email address, as well as address. And then there's a cure period. And I think in Washington, it's close to 20 days, because you do not need to certify an election in 10 or 15 days. In fact, every state should move to a 30-day certification process to, in part, accommodate what will be a tsunami of mailed out ballots coming back, or at least one that's potentially there. And I just want to get back to, I think most people do prefer to vote in a polling place in a place like Texas, where very few have ever had the experience. But I think that same poll would have showed those results in Oregon in the 1990s. And what happened in Oregon is what I sometimes call the green eggs and ham effect, named after that great piece of Western literature that Dr. Seuss wrote and my kids learned to read on. Is they resisted. No, I prefer the crunch of blue skies and autumn leaves in some places. See my neighbors. I voted against a vote by mail expansion bill as a legislator back in 1989 for these kinds of reasons. But once they have a chance to try it, even in non-pandemic times, a lot of voters find they really like it. and expect it even, and start wondering, why can't I vote in every election like this? Why can't you automatically send it to me? So it may take a couple cycles to evolve, and the logistical challenges that Secretary Wyman pointed out ought to be front and center. But they'll be there regardless of whether 15% of the votes cast in Texas come in this way, or whether 50% or more come in this way. And there's no better time to prepare than right now, beginning today, for that possibility, because that's the only responsible thing I'd argue to do. And again, even if the policy stays exactly the same.
Thank you. So Bob, respond, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier. If Texas went to doing mail ballots, would the people want to do that? When you and I spoke yesterday, I think you said that about 15 to 20% would vote by mail, 70% would want to vote in person, maybe on early voting, and then maybe another 20% would want to vote in person in any event. What do you predict would happen in Texas?
It's exactly, I think, what Phil and Kim said. We're 17.3. I'm looking at 16 million voters on my file, on my computer. 17.3, that's 2.782 million registered voters over 65. In 2016, when we had a runoff primary, we got 15,000 mail ballot requests. As of today, and this is Harris County, just the biggest county, we're at 75,000 mail-in ballots. And why is that? Exactly what Phil and Kim are hinting at, but something else you may not know about. When you get a mail ballot, you can check off on it permanent. What does that mean? Within that calendar year, you no longer have to request a mail ballot. You can now get it sent to you like VBM, just like Oregon, Colorado, and Washington. I suspect when I query people on that, we've got another panel back, they're going to start doing that. So exactly what Phil is hinting at is going to happen. We're going to get, I mean, if we have a 75,000 request for a runoff primary, can you imagine what's going to happen in November? I hope it doesn't go up much over 20, 30, and 40%, because of exactly, I think Kim said. One, we don't have the optical scanning machines. Two, we don't have contractors to print out the ballots. Three, we have not yet cured our voter list to the Postal Service. Four, we haven't educated the people. The thing we've got to do now, and our county clerk is doing it tomorrow when she meets with the Secretary of State, is ask for, I think it's something in the area of about $4 million to do a very extensive public information campaign. I watched, I remember when Seattle was debating, going from election day vote centers to vote by mail. I worked with them on this in King County, and they did the most sophisticated, they didn't do PSAs. They went to primetime advertising with local celebrities, whether they were sports, business people, artists, whatever. That's what we're going to have to do. It's not just a change, it's educating people. But there's no question in my mind that if you try to rush this and you try to make, I would actually, as a Democrat, and that's what I am, support not extending vote by mail to anyone other than over 65. We could, if we got 8 million mail-in ballots from everybody over 65, and that doesn't include all the people who are other abled and are out of the jurisdiction, I fear we would not be able not only to count the ballots, but not be able to count them even within days. And why is that important? At least in this state, a close election, which it will be, will if you announce those results late, people lose confidence. Elections are for losers. Winners are happy. It's the loser that has to believe that the election was fair. And nobody better than Kim could tell you that. She's red in a blue state. Our county election officials are, of course, all blue in a state that's all red. And it's that close. So it's important to have results on election night. Otherwise, not only will people contest, but they won't believe the result was fair. Elections are critically important in that regard.
Bob, let's go back to something else. Assume the legislature doesn't meet, the laws aren't changed. What can local and state officials do in Texas if they wanted to address the issue of people not wanting to congregate on election day, and they wanted another alternative to being over 65 and being out of the country? What else could local officials do voluntarily without changing laws?
We have asked the Secretary of State if we could do the following three things. One, locate a camera 100 feet from the polling place and have a live feed to an app that lets you see not only how long the line is at that polling location, but how spread out. And we have got funding from my own university to put those cameras up outside the 100-foot barrier. Why that? It obscures faces of individuals. What we found in our poll was that voters want to know where they can go vote safely, social distance. 2, conveniently, where they work, where they shop, where they drive during the day. 3, where there are not long lines. And they don't want somebody to tell them there aren't long lines. They want to see it for themselves. 2, allow the state to require or allow the state to allow counties to extend the hours of in-person early voting so that we can allow 12 hours of 13 days, that's 168 hours. 3, allow us to locate in-person early and election day voting at locations that may not be fully certified for ADA, that's a Disability Act, and they would be at public schools, and allow the local school districts to do it in service so they could clear out the gymnasiums, the parking lots, so that we would have square footage of 6 feet or more and parking where voters could park and safely congregate, distancing themselves while they wait to go in to vote. Then there's some other stuff that are no-brainers, but do cost money. Protective gear for the poll workers. And even down to giving out Q-tips. We are in a DRE state where you have electronic voting and people might not want to touch the screen. If you can get more machines per square foot, but you're not going to be using them all the time, you take some machines out of service, wipe them down, bring them back in, and you've got 50, but you still meet the square footage requirement. All of those should be things that Secretary of State can give dispensation to local counties on a one-time only basis.
Phil, when you and I chatted yesterday, you told me about your experiences of having voting centers or having drop boxes. There's been some discussion about driving curbside voting where you could just drive, open up the window, vote, and drop it in. I think you told me something that looked like a mailbox. Tell me what choices that you're thinking about.
Yeah, they're tan and they're made in Washington.
I understand what Bob's saying, that people are going to want to vote, but I could also see just the practical notion of expanding the window for voting absentee and letting people go to the school where there are many, many booths, or driving by and voting through your window. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, exactly. So a ballot drop box looks a bit like a supersized postal box, but it's tan rather than blue. They're made in Washington State. I think Oregon has bought some, Secretary Wyman. And you can't put a water balloon in them. They're just a small slit. You put envelopes in, and people will drive up in their cars and just put their ballot in many cases. Now, drop sites, we have over 300 in the state of Oregon. And this is important. Any one of them can be used by a voter anywhere in the state. Their ballot will eventually get back to the home county to be counted. Many of them are boxes that sit in fire stations or libraries and front counters at city halls. A vote center is a very different idea, and one that I would encourage folks in Texas to think about. A vote center is essentially a place that anyone in a county can go to, anyone, and vote a ballot that can be aligned to their particular address. So it's kind of a print-on-demand ballot kind of place. You can register to vote or update a registration. You can get language assistance or the like. You can also, of course, just deposit a ballot that's already been marked, but you have the ability to do those things so that you're not in an assigned polling place. I do not know how many thousands or tens of thousands of polling places there are in Texas, or how many tens of thousands of poll workers will need to be hired. And again, let's fast forward to a fall when suddenly this is back, and can we get anybody to man these, even with the cameras that are on them? And I would simply just point out that if you can consolidate these locations, but allow any one of the locations to serve anyone in the county, not just, oh, you must go there, you must go there, I think that would be a big help. And the final thing I'll put on the table for ideas in the spirit that Bob raised that you could do without any kind of law change, why not let anyone who receives a mailed out ballot to return it to any poll station that happens to be open? on election day? Why don't you just simply say that that will serve as an official drop site? Walk into the polling place and say, no, I don't need to stand in line to go through to get my ballot. I've already got it. It's ready to go. Just show me where the box is that I can put it in, and you can then process it. So they're small things, but they matter a great deal. And thinking through the logistics of the ballot return mechanism is important. Let's not see this reform solely in terms of how the ballots get to the voters in the first place. I agree. I don't see any reasonable chance that everyone's going to automatically get their ballot in Texas. But those who apply and qualify, and there may be a lot more than we realize, need to have options to how to return them that don't require them to stand in line and wait as if they're actually getting the ballot in the first place.
Tim, let me ask you something. You and I discussed this on the phone yesterday. I was asking you about new ideas, how to do this, asking you about technology. And we discussed, was it possible to text in your vote? Is it possible to go on the internet with your vote? Because we've discussed just practical problems of voting. If the mail is going to bring you your ballot and it doesn't get to you, what do you do? If the ballot gets you and you don't have a stamp, what do you do? If you forget to sign it and it's returned and they're getting a ballot that's not signed, what do you do? So it seems easier to go on the internet or to text it. What's your answer to that?
Well, as I see Dr. Stein, having a physical reaction, I think that sums it up. 20 years ago, I was a county election official, and we had a parallel non-binding trial that we did for an internet voting company that had encrypted technology. This was state of the art, even probably by today's standards. And I wrote a white paper and came to two conclusions that have not changed in that 20-year period of time. My first conclusion was the simple one that I think everybody can see, that the internet was never designed to be a secure transmission method of data or information. And people would argue, well, billions of dollars go over the internet every day, why can't votes? Well, the difference between the banking industry and the elections community is a standard. The banking industry can absorb a level of fraud. They do every single day. There are transactions they can make you whole when your credit card has been hacked, and they can then refund you and take that loss. We can't do that in elections and instill confidence. But let's pretend for a minute that you could do all of those things. You could create this very secure system. The second bar is the one that I don't see us overcoming anytime soon. And that is me as an election official being able to convince the most rabid right-wing conservative Republican to the most liberal, progressive, whatever monikers you want to use on the left, Democrat, and everyone in between, that election was fair and accurate. And the way that you do that is what I've been talking about. You have to balance access and security. So if you make something very accessible, you have to have the security controls on the back end to demonstrate to those critics that election was both secure and accurate. And what I mean by that is, having been through the closest governor's race in the country's history, and having not only attorneys with a microscope looking over every single Chad that was on the back of a ballot, but having that on the nightly news for a good 30-day period, I can tell you that when you get to that point in an election, no one is logical. Everyone is emotional. They are angry because their candidate isn't winning, or or they're feeling like they've been slighted in some way, and they do court challenges, and all of that happens in a very emotional place. And so we can hold up that ballot, and we can both look at that ballot, and Phil may see a vote for Smith, and I may see a vote for Jones, and we may argue it ferociously, maybe even in front of a judge. But at the end of the day, there's something about that tangible ballot that gives it credibility. Now you take that same environment in states like Texas, and I'm not that familiar with the voting system that Texas has, but let me use a different state. Let's use the Georgia election in 2018 for governor, where you had touchscreen voting devices. And at the end of the day, the only thing we can go back and look at is an electronic audit trail. It is lines of code. So if you're comfortable with lines of code, you're probably going to say, yeah, I'm sure it's fine. The further from that you are, The harder it is going to be for me as an election official to convince you that it was a fair election. And that's what, internet voting or whatever you want to use, touchscreen voting, whatever, all of those electronic methods, that's their Achilles heel, is that there isn't something physical to go back and recount, hand count, ranked choice, not ranked choice voting, excuse me, risk limiting audit, whatever you use, there's something you can use and you can compare the paper to the electronic. And in internet voting, any kind of, whatever, even an attachment in an email, all of those things can be hacked, all of those things can be altered. And we have to convince people to a higher standard than just, hey, look at the lines of code and trust me, because I don't want anyone to have to trust me. I want people to believe.
Well, I now understand why it's okay for a bank, because they can sustain a little bit of loss of money, but it can't happen in an election. Let me ask you just a practical problem, just a practical issue. A couple of hours ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that Johns Hopkins came out with a report today saying that the US confirmed COVID cases now exceed 1 million and that the deaths exceed 57,000, which is a whopping big number. As a practical matter, what happens if we have an election and the judges don't show up? Bob, you and I talked yesterday just about the practical issue of what it takes to run an election. You need a poll watcher there to open the door of the church or the school. They've got to have the machine, set up the machine, have the lists, hand out the ballot, hand the ballot and show somebody how to work it at the machine, take the ballot back, show them how to get the ballot, insert it into the counter, get the counter done, and monitor that. And for my voting spot, there are 4 or 5 people that do that. So we assume that the voters are going to come. We assume that. I believe the voters are going to come. We're all focused on how to accommodate the voters, but what are we going to do about the poll watchers? Bob Stein, you told me we can't do without the poll watchers. Kim and Phil, I'm sure that you agree. What do you do?
Let me just say, poll workers, not watchers. They're a different breed. We surveyed close to 2,000 of about 6,000 poll workers in Harris County. And these are astounding people committed to working for not very much money. I think we give them $75 a day as a poll judge. Poll workers get about, I think, 15 for a shift. Remarkably, they're all going to show up. Remarkably. I shouldn't say all. There were some that were concerned.
Bob, you handle disasters, tornadoes, you handle earthquakes, and you handle hurricanes. You know about that. So are you predicting that with the numbers that we just know about from Johns Hopkins, that the folks are still going to show up to vote at the general election on election day?
Let me say 2 things. There's voters.
Wait, instead of the voters, I want to ask you differently. The poll workers
are going to show up. The answer is, as of what's the 24th, we started the survey of poll workers online, and we have less than about 1% who are hesitant. These are men and women who have been trained, certified, eligible to work in the July primary runoff, and they are, not only are they committed, but many of them, we had a question, we asked them, how important is it to you? How important is the fee you are paid to be a poll worker to you? 1/3 said it was extremely or very important. And why? We have a lot of people who work our polls, who are of color, who are of low income, for whom this coronavirus has taken them out of the workforce. And if you get $75 for 13 days plus election day, that could be more than 2 months of rent in parts of Houston. I think the poll workers are going to show up. The question is, are we going to protect them? Are we going to also provide them the kind of equipment that can do their jobs? One of your attendees asked me, well, if you're going to get this many mail ballots, and we're going to get more, I think Phil was absolutely right. We will probably get close to 20% ballots, poll ballots, mail ballots requested. But we got to have the facilities, the envelopes, the paper to mail them out, the ability to count them, and the poll workers. You know what you have to do with a mail ballot. Looking at Phil and Kim, you have to open it up. You know why people walk their ballots in? Phil knows this paper. 2/3 of every voter that gets mailed a ballot in Utah, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon not only walks their ballot in, but here's what's really interesting. It's where they walk it into. They walk it into a drop-off location closest to their home precinct. And they've been doing that since 1994 when I've been watching it. And it's been from I think 13 in Colorado and a little earlier in Washington. And why is that? Many frequent voters want to be seen and see other people voting. They're not afraid of the Postal Service. They think the Postal Service is great. They just want that personal experience. Problem? They don't return their ballots before 2 or 3 days before Election Day. Often bring them in on or just before Election Day. We ran an experiment in El Paso County in Colorado with some messaging. We increased the rate at which ballots were returned early. There are lots of things you can do, but they take time.
Bob,
Our state does not allow you to return ballots anywhere but through the post office or at the county courthouse. Phil's idea is a wonderful one, but there's a reason why the Republicans are in a majority. They control those access points, and we're not going to get the law changed in time.
Kim, let me see if we can get in a couple of questions from the audience. Anna asked this question. Through the public health system crisis, we've seen an unprecedented number of new solutions for all sorts of issues rolled out quickly. So it doesn't make sense for me that time would be a huge issue. We need to make voting safe. So what's the easiest system to set up to allow people to vote safely?
There's not a one-size-fits-all answer, and it really depends on where the state or the county is in terms of their absentee returns and the return rates. So all of the things that Dr. Stein was just talking about are all factors, but the cold hard reality is what can you spin up? So if you have a large county, and I apologize, I can't remember in Austin and Dallas what are the county's names, but in those big city, Houston, Dallas, Austin, population centers, you're going to be dealing with very large volumes and in short periods of time. What is that certification window that Secretary Keisling talked about after Election Day? That's really critical when half of your ballots are going to come in on Monday and Tuesday of election week. Half. Whatever that number is, half. So do you have the high-speed envelope sorters to be able to process them and count those ballots in the ballot processing center? Do you have tabulation readers that can process those efficiently and get you results? One of the things, the expectation changes that has to happen in Texas is you're not going to have election night results. You're going to be lucky to have results certified, whatever your certification window is. In Washington State, it's 10 days for a special election. Today is an election day in our state, very small election, but we'll have 10 days to certify that. In a primary election, it's 15. In a general election, it's 20. And I can tell you that county officials use every moment of that to process all of those ballots. So it's building out that capacity for the processing. And I would like to go back to another thing that Dr. Stein said about the workforce. So in a polling place environment, you have a lot of people you have to have either in the early voting window or on election day that have to be there to staff the polling places and the vote centers. But realizing even in a pure vote by mail setting, you have to have that same number of people in that voting window 30 to 60 days before election day and probably 30 days after election day. And I can tell you from my experience in our state, and I think this is pretty universal across the country, but I don't have data to back it up like the professor does, but I would say the average age of our election workers is 70, average age. We have the highest risk group are the ones who are doing the staffing the polling places and the vote centers and the ballot processing centers. We are going to have a significant staff shortage. I guarantee it. And we're going to have to recruit to backfill those positions and have backup people in case they get sick. So that's probably beyond the equipment and the space, staffing is one of the biggest issues facing us regardless of system.
Phil, your thoughts?
I remember when I first became Secretary of State in 1991, I went to a conference of clerks and I was at the lunch table and one of them said, I think the average age of my poll workers now is 70 years old. And another clerk leaned across the table and said, Sharon, what's your secret in getting them so young? Now, there's too much truth to that. And I applaud this amazing public service spiritedness that you're finding, Dr. Stein, in the survey that you're doing and people's commitment to be on the job or seeing it with healthcare workers and nurses and delivery people and sanitation workers. It is a remarkable thing about the American character, that sense of duty that people have.
We're going to get cut off. We're going to get cut off momentarily. Bay, do you want to wrap up?
I would love to. Thank you so much. We want to be really respectful of people's time, although I could listen to this for a lot longer. It was really fascinating and enlightening discussion. So thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. I know we've gotten a lot of questions about whether this has been recorded. It has been recorded, and we will be sending it out to all the attendees. If you have a question that didn't get answered, then you can send it along to me either through the TexPIRG website contact form or at bscoggin@texpirg.org, and I will attempt to harangue and hassle our panelists to see if we can get a good answer for you. But once again, thank you so much, panelists. We're all very grateful, I'm sure, of your participation, and again, our co-sponsors, thanks to them as well. So thanks for everybody to come in. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.